The story opens with a sweeping shot high across the tree line of a lush, green rainforest. Intercut is a sequence of images of Jake Sully, Sam Worthington, a crippled war veteran and former Marine. He wakes up in a giant spaceship on its way to Pandora, a thickly forested Earth-like moon orbiting Polyphemus, a giant blue planet similar to Jupiter. He is one of a large number of passengers, all waking up after almost 6 years of cryosleep en route to Pandora. Drifting out of his sleeping pod in 0G, he's tended by the ship's staff. He opens his locker, which is marked Sully T. Jake tells us that he has a deceased twin brother, Tom, a scientist, who was to be part of a high-level program overseen by corporate and military strategists to study the environment and inhabitants of Pandora. Because Jake and his brother are an exact genetic match, he was presented with a unique opportunity: take over his brother's contract with a corporate military entity and travel light years away to an outpost on the previously glimpsed world, Pandora. Acknowledging the notions of being free and having a fresh start, Jake agrees to the deal as his brother's body is cremated. Now being transported from the spaceship to Pandora via a shuttle, Jake is one of many soldiers and civilian personnel about to touch down on Pandora, some 4.3 light-years from Earth. We catch views of the base and its construction and immense mining machines digging up the soil in a large quarry as Jake ponders his new role. The passengers are all instructed to wear a full-face breathing mask since the atmosphere of the planet will not support human life. 20 seconds of exposure to the poisonous atmosphere of the planet causes unconsciousness, with death occurring about 4 minutes later. While the other passengers disembark and take their first steps onto the base, called Hell's Gate, which is surrounded by a huge perimeter fence, Jake follows them in his wheelchair, earning the moniker Meals on Wheels from a few haughty Marines. He acknowledges through voiceover that he lost the use of his legs during one of his tours of duty on Earth, and while a spinal injury like his can be fixed, it takes money, which is tough to come by in the present economy. Jake goes immediately to a military briefing where Colonel Miles Quaritch, Stephen Lang, is addressing the assembled soldiers and a few civilians who have come along. He reminds them they're not in Kansas anymore, and he tells them about Pandora's indigenous population, the Nasics. Quaritch, sporting a heavy set of scars on the side of his head, says they are hard to kill, and practically everything out there will try to kill you. And, while it's his job to keep his people alive, he says he will not succeed in this task, not with all of you. If they wish to survive, he continues, they will have to follow Pandora rules. Jake goes to a science lab where he meets biologist Norm Spellman, Joel David Moore, and Dr. Max Patel, Dilip Rao, 2 members of the Avatar program. As Jake gets his first look at his own avatar, we learn about the program itself. Humans are unable to breathe Pandora's air, but the Avatar program enables a human to link with their own avatar, a genetically bred human Nasics hybrid, and function as if they were a Nasics native. In his avatar body, Jake will be able to walk again and breathe the atmosphere. The avatars look very much like their human drivers. When Norm tells Jake his avatar looks like him, Jake profoundly says it looks like his dead brother. Jake and Norm enter the science department just about the time Dr. Grace Augustine, Sigourney Weaver, the program's science lead, awakens in a specially designed pod that links her to her avatar and flips open the top. Norm says to Jake he hears she likes plants better than people. She arises from her pod and converses in Nasics with Norm. Satisfied with Norm's command of the language, she turns to Jake. She tells him she needs his brother Tom, the PhD who trained 3 years for the Pandora mission, but she doesn't need Jake since Jake has no lab experience and has never been linked to an avatar. Jake tries to imply that he's a quick learner, but the ill-tempered Grace isn't impressed. Grace storms off to the base's control room to confront Parker Selfridge, Giovanni Ribisi, base commander and representative for the Resources Development Administration, RDA, a corporation that oversees all military and other personnel on the colony. He tells her Jake will serve as a security escort on her team while they're on the planet's surface. Grace tells Parker she needs a researcher, not a jarhead dropout. She doubts Jake will be of any use to her botanical research. Parker replies, saying he disagrees, saying they lucked out with Jake. Since he's a perfect genetic match for the avatar intended for his twin brother, they can use his military skills in an avatar body toward the overall objective of the operation, mining the mineral unobtainium, a potent source of energy that sells for many millions a kilo, and can bring cheap power back to a dying Earth. Parker tells Grace one way to help accomplish this objective is to win the hearts and minds of the natives, to obtain their cooperation. Grace argues that many of the Na-6 have been killed by the military under the auspices of Selfridge's operation. Back in the lab next morning, Jake and Norm are linked to their avatars for the first time. Jake, in his avatar, wakes up in a different room with other avatars and staff. Within a few moments, Jake is making his handlers nervous because, overjoyed with his ability to move his legs again, he is moving too quickly in trying to walk, the first time he has been able to do so since becoming a paraplegic. The human lab workers cannot stop him. A Na-6 is over 10 feet tall, sometimes closer to 12 feet, and far stronger than humans. When his long tail knocks over instruments, a staff member tells him to stop and lie down again. Jake ignores him and bursts out of the room and into the daylight. He finds himself in a recreation area where other avatars are playing sports and staff, in their protective gear, are performing various duties. Jake meets Grace's avatar, who, better tempered than human Grace, accompanies Jake to the barracks where he is eventually encouraged to rest. Before he lies down to sleep, Jake inspects his neural queue, a long appendage that looks like a braid of hair. At the end of his queue is a cluster of hidden tendrils. When the avatar sleeps, the link is broken and Jake himself awakens. Jake later meets Trudy Chacon, Michelle Rodriguez, a retired Marine pilot with whom he'll spend several weeks getting used to his avatar and exploring Pandora. Jake will serve as the door gunner on her crew. Jake meets with Colonel Quaritch, who is lifting weights. The colonel tells Jake he's looked up his service record and was impressed with what he accomplished on some of his tours, including one in Venezuela. The colonel warns Jake about the dangers awaiting him on Pandora. He also states his belief that the Avatar program is a joke but that it offers an opportunity for a unique reconnaissance mission, if Jake can find out and tell the colonel what he wants to know about the natives, how to persuade them to move away from the unobtainium or deposits and how to hit them hard if they won't. The colonel will see to it that Jake gets the surgery he needs to regain use of his legs. The colonel climbs into an AMP suit, a bipedal exoskeleton used for missions on Pandora, and moves off. Relinked with his avatar, Jake flies over Pandora's surface in Trudy's gunship, along with Grace, Norm, and others. The team lands in a forest, where Grace and Norm begin to take samples of the flora and make measurements. Jake is distracted by his surroundings and wanders into a field of helicaradian flowers, which are quite tall and shrink at Jake's touch. Trouble arrives when a Titanothere, a heavily armored, hammerhead creature, confronts Jake. Grace orders him to stand his ground and not shoot, or else the animal will get angry and charge. His armor is too thick for guns to have any effect anyway. Jake successfully holds his ground, but only because another beast, a panther-like Thanator, has approached him from behind and has caused the Titanotheres to retreat and surround their young. The Thanator then turns to Jake. Grace tells him to run, and he's pursued by the Thanator in a chase that separates Jake from his crew. He loses his gun and is downed by the animal, but frees himself by releasing his backpack. Ultimately, the chase leads to a waterfall, where Jake jumps to safety, leaving the Thanator roaring above him. Jake's crew searches for him but Trudy says they'll have to return to base since night ops are not allowed. Grace says he won't last the night. It's now night and we see Jake sharpening a long stick into a spear. Jake is being watched from above, this time by a Na-6. The Na-6 aims an arrow at Jake and is about to shoot, but decides against it when small, ethereal, luminescent creatures land on her bow. Later we learn they are very pure spirits, also known as the Seeds of Iowa, the novice all-powerful god. The archer retreats. Jake is stalked by a pack of viper wolves. He dips the end of his spear into a combustible pitch-like liquid. He lights the end and uses it as a torch against the viper wolves, who encircle him, teeth bared, jaws gnashing. The animals attack Jake, he fights back, kills some, and is taken down by others. The archer who was observing Jake joins the battle on his side. She kills some viper wolves and causes the rest to flee. She tenderly puts out of their misery some whimpering wounded animals and says prayers over them. Jake attempts to thank her for helping him fight off the attackers. She meets his thanks with scorn, tells him all this is his fault, that they did not need to die, and that he should go back to where he came from. Jake asks if she feels that way, why she helped him. You have a strong heart. No fear, she explains. But stupid. Jake attempts to follow his rescuer up into a tree, asks for her help, and says he wants to learn. He's repulsed and told to go back, that sky people can't be taught. Just then, the seeds of Iowa reappear and start to land on the nervous Jake. He asks what they are. Very pure spirits, she replies, and Jake is covered by them, making an impression on his companion. When the seeds drift off, she relents and tells him to come with her. As Jake tries to keep up with his rescuer, Neytiri, Zoe Saldana, he is felled by a bilalo thrown by a patrol of Omaticayan warriors. Their leader is Tsute, Laz Alonso, next in line to the throne, and the man Neytiri is expected to marry. Neytiri stops them from harming Jake by telling them there has been a sign from Iowa. Tsute tells his men to bring him along to Tashik, father, approximate spelling, and Iowa, mother. Jake is presented to Neytiri's parents, Itukin, West Studi, and Emoat, CCH Pounder, who are the king and queen of the tribe, respectively. Jake tells the elders that he is a warrior, a dreamwalker, and his intention is to learn from them. Emoat pricks Jake's chest and tastes his blood, decreeing it is the will of Iowa for him to live with the Omaticaya, and for Neytiri, however reluctantly, to be his teacher in their ways and customs. After a ritual gathering, Jake is brought to his bed, a leaf high up in the home tree, that encircles him like a cocoon. As he falls asleep, human Jake is revived. At morning chow, all the scientists, including Grace, are focused on everything Jake has to say. Norm seems very disappointed and sullen, he was Grace's original choice to bond with the Omaticaya. Even the military and corporate reps have warmed to Jake. Hometree sits atop a massive deposit of unobtainium, so Jake appears to be their best shot at convincing the Omaticaya to move or advising the colonel on how to force them to do so. He's informed that he has 3 months to achieve his objective before the bulldozers arrive. The next scenes revolve around Avatar Jake's training with Neytiri and human Jake's reports on his experiences via the video log he dictates after every day's activity. He bonds with his dire horse, an important animal to the Nasiks. Jake must learn to mount the animal and connect his neural cue to its antenna. Human Jake continues to report on the Hometree's infrastructure and other Nasiks details. Jake has a difficult time learning how to control his dire horse and is often referred to as Sksong, Skown, by Neytiri and Tsute, which he tells us means moron. Jake reports back to the colonel and Selfridge about the Omaticaya's home, the giant home tree. Underneath it is a large deposit of unobtainium. Jake tells them about the structure of the 1,000-foot-tall tree. Quaritch sees an opportunity to destroy the tree, but Jake requests he be allowed to negotiate with the Nasiks and convince them to leave. Sensing that Jake is being manipulated by Quaritch, Selfridge and the rest of the military section of the mining operation, Grace decides to take her operation out of Dodge. She moves them into the Hallelujah Mountains, a remote region of immense, floating islands that are sacred to the Nasiks and are also rich in unobtainium. Grace wants her turf away from the RDA officials and military types at the base. In his next video log, Jake discusses his language lessons and says his time with the Nasiks is like field stripping a weapon. Enough repetition and you can't help but learn it. This is intercut with scenes of his continued training with Neytiri, who teaches him about the Na-6 forest connection. She tells Jake that all energy is borrowed and one day we have to give it back. Jake seems to comprehend this, and as he says a prayer for an animal he hunted and just killed, Neytiri says that he is ready for an important rite of passage, to bond with and ride a Declan, a flying mountain banshee. To reach the banshee's nesting grounds, Jake must accompany Neytiri, Tsute and 2 other Na-6 trainees to the highest region of the Hallelujah Mountains. Several factors, the height, the ferocity of the untamed banshees, make this a dangerous lesson, but Jake's lack of fear and successful bond with his banshee earn him the grudging respect of the Na-6 warriors present, even Tsute. He makes the bond with the tendrils in his queue, and as he rides the flying animal he remarks that he's not much of a horseman but he was born to do this. Jake, Neytiri, and the others ride together to the Tree of Souls, the most sacred place to the Na-6. While flying on a hunting sortie, Jake and Neytiri are suddenly pursued and attacked by a creature known to the Na-6 as Toruk, a giant and brightly colored flying mountain banshee with murderous intentions toward everything that flies. Neytiri says its name means last shadow. The Toruk's shadow, once seen, is usually the last shadow one ever gets to see, as its attack is almost always fatal. Back at Home Tree, Neytiri shows Jake the skeleton of a precursor of the present Toruk. She tells him the last person to ride a Toruk was her grandfather's grandfather, who used the animal to unite the 5 Na-6 tribes in a time of great sorrow. Such a person would earn the title Toruk Mado, rider of the last shadow. When Jake comes back to his human form, it's clear he's been changed by this latest experience, for he says, "Out there is the real world, in here is the dream." The colonel comes over to him to tell him his mission is accomplished and he's to return to Earth that day. And good to his word, the colonel has arranged for Jake to get the treatment he needs to regain use of his legs. Jake wishes to delay his departure because he says he's right at the point at which he's to be initiated into the tribe and accepted as one of them, and then would have the status to negotiate with the Na-6 to relocate. The colonel acquiesces. Jake attends a Na-6 ceremony, where he learns the Na-6 believe that every person can be born twice. Neytiri leads Jake to a place of prayer, the Tree of Voices, where they use their cues to bond with the tree. Neytiri tells Jake he can make a bow from the tree, and that he can choose a woman. Jake tells Neytiri that he has already chosen her, and she says that she has chosen him. They sleep together under the tree and Jake wakes up back in the lab. In the morning, Neytiri awakens to falling trees, then the presence of bulldozers. Soldiers are advancing as the forest falls around Neytiri, who is dragging and carrying Jake to safety. At their remote spot, Jake is getting ready to link with his avatar, and when he finally revives, Jake climbs onto one of the bulldozers and tries to stop it, eventually smashing its camera system and drawing some gunfire. Other Na-6 warriors arrive, while the colonel, reviewing films back at the base, recognizes Jake in his avatar form as the person who tried to stop their mission. The bulldozers continue their operation, wiping out the sacred ground. At Home Tree, the Na-6 want war. Grace and Jake argue against it. There's an intense debate. Tsute tries to kill Jake, jealous at having learned that Jake and Neytiri are mated for life when he and Neytiri were betrothed. Jake declares he is a Na-6 and deserves the right to speak. Suddenly, both Grace and Jake's avatars fall unconscious as the links between them and their human forms are abruptly broken by the enraged colonel, who arrests Jake for trying to stop the bulldozers. Grace and Jake face off with RDA and military brass. Grace reveals that Pandora's trees form a network that has more neural connections than exist in the human brain and that the Na-6 can tap into that network. Consequently, the Omatokea will never leave Home Tree. Parker and the colonel discuss options. He will launch an attack on Home Tree and use gas bombs to drive out the Na-6. Jake presses to be allowed to return to the Omatokea to try to convince them to leave, and he's granted 1 hour to achieve that objective. Jake and Grace are not welcomed back. Neytiri rejects Jake. Both Jake and Grace are bound and left behind by the Omaticaya, who are preparing to fight against the humans, who have arrived in a large fleet of flying ships. The fleet launches gas canisters into Home Tree and the surrounding area. As the battle escalates, most of the weaponry is targeted at the root structure of Home Tree, which is toppled by a series of explosions and heavy artillery. Many Omaticaya are killed. Moat frees Jake and Grace and asks them to save the tribe. Jake arrives and is rejected again by Neytiri when he tries to console her. Neytiri's father Itukin is killed by a large piece of shrapnel. His dying wish is for Neytiri to take his sacred bow and assume leadership of their people. The destruction seems endless, and, suddenly, Jake and Grace return to their human bodies and are promptly placed under arrest for treason. Norm is also arrested for trying to prevent soldiers from disabling their avatar forms. The Gnostics gather at the Tree of Souls. Trudy arrives at the cell which holds Jake, Grace, and Norm. She dupes their guard by saying she wants nothing to do with them, only to knock out the guard an instant later. As they prepare to flee the base, Grace is shot and wounded by the colonel. The team flies Trudy's ship to the remote lab in the floating mountains and they take a pod to another spot in the forest. Jake returns to his avatar body. The hopeful reunion with the Omaticaya is not to be, initially. Jake is an outcast, an alien. So he makes a bold decision. He realizes that to regain the trust of the Gnostics, he has to take things to a higher level. He summons his Banshee and sets off to find the Toruk. His strategy is simple but can easily result in death. Jake believes that the Toruk never looks for an attack above himself and thus he can be approached that way. Jake jumps off his Banshee and onto the back of the Toruk. We next see him arrive riding the Toruk at the Tree of Souls in the middle of an Omaticayan ceremony. Jake has successfully bonded with the Toruk. The Omaticaya are stunned to see their greatest legend come true. Jake dismounts and makes his way through the crowd of Gnostics, who, awed, part before him. When he reaches Neytiri, each holds out an arm to the other and she says, "I see you." Sute, who is now tribe leader, concedes Jake's new role of Toruk Mado. He accords Jake much respect. Jake convinces Moat to help Grace, who is dying. Moat begins the preparations, which involve getting Grace's human and avatar bodies in place at the Tree of Souls. The idea is to permanently transfer Grace's consciousness to her avatar. Moat lets it be known that Grace must pass through the Eye of Iwa, and that the Great Mother might choose to let her pass through to her avatar self, or she might opt to have Grace remain with her. The ritual is not successful, though before she dies, Grace tells Jake that she has seen Iwa. Jake, heartbroken and furious, speaks as Toruk Mado and says it's time to send a message to the Sky people that this is their, the Gnostics, land. But to do so, they first must go to each of the Gnostics clans to ask them to come and fight as one. Sute will be the Omaticayan's new clan leader and will also help rally other clans to fight with them. The human military have picked up the infusion of Gnostics into the area, from a few hundred to 2,000 within a day. At this rate, the colonel says as he addresses his troops, the Gnostics will soon total 20,000, at which point their perimeter will be overrun. Rather than let that happen, he continues, they must stage a preemptive attack while they still can. Their plan is to turn a space shuttle into the carrier of a massive bomb. Their target is the Tree of Souls, and the attack is planned for 0600 the next day. They believe that if they destroy the Tree of Souls, the Gnostics will go away and never come near this place again. Jake is busy rallying the Omaticaya. At the Tree of Souls, he uses his cue to bond with the tree and asks Iwa to look into Grace's memories, stressing that humankind killed their mother, Earth, the entity that protects the balance of life. Neytiri appears and tells Jake that Iwa does not take sides. Quaritch masses his fleet, mostly as protection for the Valkyrie shuttle. The bomb ship and the fleet move toward the Tree of Souls. The united Na-6 force begins to arrive from the sky and on the ground. Jake on his Toruk, Tsute, and other warriors engage in battle with the military aircraft, mainly Scorpion assault ships. Casualties mount on both sides. The gunships have unmatched firepower, but are no match for the Declans, who grab hold of them and smash them against each other. Jake, riding the Toruk, is pursued and shot at by Colonel Quaritch's Dragonfly ship. Trudy arrives and opens fire on the Colonel's command ship. Neytiri's Banshee is shot down and killed. Norm's avatar is mortally wounded and he jumps back to his human form. Tsute takes on the bomb ship and is killed in the attempt. Trudy dies when her ship is destroyed in a hail of gunfire from Quaritch's Dragonfly. Neytiri watches this action from the ground. Jake attempts to contact Tsute and is unsuccessful, as is his attempt to reach Trudy. Meanwhile, the bomb ship closes in on the Tree of Souls. Jake tells Neytiri via communicator to disengage from the fight. Suddenly, through what's left of the surrounding forest, a battalion of Titanotheres, Pandora's heavily armored dinosaur-like animals, arrives and engages the Earth forces. They quickly lay waste to infantry and soldiers in AMP suits. Overjoyed that Iwa has heard Jake's plea for help, Neytiri rejoins the fight with many other of Pandora's species behind her. When a Thanator appears nearby, it bows to her submissively. Jake and his Toruk take to the sky to confront the bomb ship as the military's ground forces retreat in disarray. Approaching from above, Jake grenades the bomb ship. It crashes in flames and explosions well away from the Tree of Souls. Jake also throws explosives into vulnerable parts of the command ship. It begins to burn and go down. Colonel Quaritch puts on an AMP suit and jumps free of the command ship before it disintegrates in a ball of flames. He finds himself at the temporary camp set up by Grace. In the camp, Jake is inside his avatar pod. Quaritch, set on killing Jake, is now attacked by a Thanator that Neytiri had bonded with and ridden to the site. With the aid of his AMP suit, the Colonel kills the Thanator and Neytiri is trapped underneath it. Before the Colonel has a chance to kill Neytiri, Jake arrives in his avatar. The two engage in combat, the Colonel in his AMP suit and Jake as his avatar, armed only with a piece of pipe. Jake smashes the suit's plastic canopy, the Colonel pops it off, dons a breathing mask, and, before he moves off toward the structures that house the pods, asks Jake how it feels to have betrayed his race. "You think you're one of them?" "Time to wake up," he taunts, as he smashes into the mobile lab, looking for Jake's pod, intent on destroying it and human Jake. The battle resumes. Jake is grabbed by an arm of the AMP suit and hangs from his queue before the Colonel. Meanwhile, Neytiri has almost freed herself. The Colonel now moves Jake closer to him and reaches for his knife, intending to finish Jake by slitting his throat. Suddenly, Neytiri shoots an arrow at the Colonel, impaling him through the center of his chest. The Colonel, reeling, is unable to continue his attack on Jake. Neytiri's second arrow lodges right next to the first. It brings the Colonel in the AMP suit to the ground. However, much damage has been done to the lab, which is leaking in the planet's poisonous atmosphere. Human Jake is awake but having difficulty both breathing and trying to get a mask on. Neytiri arrives and helps Jake on with his mask. Cradling human Jake, she says, "I see you." It's the first time they have seen each other face to face. Back at Hell's Gate, most of the remaining humans are being marched into a shuttle to be sent back to Earth. However, a select few Earth people, such as Norm and Dr. Patel, are invited to stay on Pandora. Jake signs off in his final video log, where we learn that he has chosen to transfer his consciousness to his avatar for good. In a ceremony similar to Grace's, Jake passes through the eye of Iwa, and wakes up in his avatar with Neytiri watching over him.